Hello. Welcome to All the Things. I am Monique Dusan.
And I'm Krista Bontrager, also known as Theology Mom.
And this is the show where we talk about all things related to God, the Bible, and real life.
Here we are again in our brand new studio.
Yes.
What is this, show number 2?
Show number 2. I'm just really excited because we got through the opening without a mistake. I do feel successful. This is going to be a good show, you guys.
All right. Helping us on the show tonight and each and every week is the one and only Bob Bontrager.
Whoop, whoop.
Except there is actually 2 Bob Bontragers because his dad also has the same.
Oh.
All right.
Guess that's true.
And we are live.
Yes.
We are not on tape.
We are not on tape. We've been gone. We've been...
You were gone for 2 weeks.
I was gone for almost 3 weeks. It'd have been 3 weeks on Tuesday. But glad to be back. Had some adventures in Georgia. Went down and spoke at a camp for a week with my podcast co-host for Off Code, Kevin Briggins. And then together we were at Impact 360, and that was amazing. Camp was amazing as well. But it was just a really good, 2 weeks. Then we went to a wedding.
We did.
Went to a wedding in Texas.
And then you went and pretended to be a single parent for several days with your nephews.
Yes, I actually had the opportunity to babysit 2 of my nephews. My oldest nephew plays travel ball and was invited to an invitational in Georgia. So we just missed each other. And nephew 2 and 3 were home alone. And so I got to go down and be auntie for my nephews who are 11. My baby nephew is 11 and the middle nephew is 13. And we had a good time. Like, I was so excited. I'm so glad I did that.
You just let them eat cake every day and stay up as late as they want?
Well, the internet goes off at a certain time.
Oh.
So there's that. And they like to do video games. And they need the internet for that. But their parents are pretty strict on the timing and things like that. But we did eat a lot of ice cream. I'm not going to lie. It was a lot of ice cream. A lot of ice cream and a lot of movies.
That's right.
Yes.
Well, good for you.
Yeah.
You had a good time. You said you were pretty tired.
I was exhausted. I don't know how people can do it, and especially with boys, because they are rambunctious. They go.
You finally sent them outside to wash your car.
Yeah, that didn't go so well, but yeah.
Tired of them.
Yeah, I sent them outside, and they also have a huge dog, but they're just boys. They eat all the time. I was like, you know what? Today for lunch, we're having ice cream. Lunch is going to be, because I'm not cooking. I don't know how people do this here thing with children, but I'm not accustomed. Yeah. Didn't feel like I wasn't built for it.
All
Yeah.
right.
And so, yes.
All right. So we are live. We want to invite everyone to add your voice to the stream tonight. We're going to have Neil Shenvy on in just a few moments here. This is the show where we actually read the comments.
Yes.
And incorporate your questions into the stream. So go ahead and put those into the thing.
Now, before I forget, how are you? What have you been doing? Because we talked about me. I don't want to just jump over.
Oh, I was going on with the house cleaning.
I know. How are you?
Oh, okay.
Because you asked me if I was going to ask you.
Well,
so I'm making sure.
yeah, doing good. Just living life and keeping busy.
I thought you had some announcement. Never mind.
No, I don't have any announcements.
Okay. I thought you was going to tell me something good. Okay.
Well, I have a big secret.
What is it? You didn't say anything. You're such a mess. Let's keep going.
All right. So tonight's moderators are the one and only Emily Bontrager and Laura Hartley.
Whoop,
so make sure to hit that thumbs up, and that helps propagate the show out. It forces the robots to send out the notifications.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm trying not to cough.
And Neil must be backstage like, what are they doing? My gosh.
When I'm talking slow, I'm resting my voice so I don't cough. Okay, this show is brought to you by
Family 210 Clothing.
Yeah, the Center for Biblical Unity and the Theology Mom podcast. So go check out our t-shirt designs if I can look at the right camera. All right, there's one of mine for Theology Mom. I don't co-parent with the government. You can go check that out at family210.com. All right.
By the way, Chris, that screen it or something.
Don't tap your mic cable.
Okay. All right. I don't know if I can sit and not touch the cable, but I'll try.
Do it.
All right.
Queens.
Drag queens. Tonight we're talking about queer theory.
Yes.
Emily sent me some crazy paper yesterday. Drag pedagogy. Mm-hmm. This was in a journal called Curriculum Inquiry. And it's called Drag Pedagogy, the Playful Practice of Queer Imagination in Early Childhood. This is a sort of a horrifying paper.
The authors are someone by the name of Harper Keenan, and the co-author is Little Miss Hot Mess.
Who's a drag queen?
Little Miss Hot Mess. Yet, I feel like, now, you know what? I'm not going to say that because Lord don't like ugly. So I'm just going to keep it to myself.
But drag queens are everywhere now. It's like the nexus of culture.
It is. And I think we have to ask a bigger question of, if people are writing about the drag pedagogy, what is the intent? And especially if you are looking at it in early childhood education, what is the intent? What is the goal of introducing drag queens to your 5-year-old? We have a lot to talk about with my cousin Neil. I'm just saying. I have questions. Yeah,
it is interesting. I'm trying to find a little quote here that part of it is to, reduce stigmatization of shame surrounding drag play and helping to it's not simply about LGBT lives, but introducing the idea of living queerly. So there's definitely, it seems like in this article, at least, the goal here is normalization. I mean, you got these drag queens in public school libraries or public libraries, middle school assemblies, neighborhood block parties. I've seen several of those on Twitter.
Well, someone on YouTube, Karen, just said, this is very timely. Tomorrow, there is a Drag Me to Church event in Fort Myers, Florida. Will be a drag show and drinks. They say proceeds will benefit local churches. If your church is accepting the proceeds from a drag queen story hour, you need to go ahead and just walk on. You need to go on and shake the dust off your sandals and pray for them. But I mean, that's just my own personal opinion. You don't have to take it from the Lord, but I don't know that's really biblical.
Okay. So big picture, what we have to know is queer theory is really just one of the branches of the critical social theories. Neil's going to walk us through some of the specifics.
Yeah.
So glad he's here. So let's get him on.
Yes, let's do it.
All right. Fire up the Zoom machine. There he is.
Hello.
Yes.
Now we have all kind of questions.
Okay. I'll try to answer.
Yes.
I mean, the questions are here and they are real.
All right. Well, let's start off with, for those 3 people who are watching who don't know who you are, maybe give us the 1-minute introduction of who you are and how you became interested in studying the critical social theories.
Sure. So I'm is Neil Shenvy. This was not my field. I have a PhD in theoretical chemistry from UC Berkeley. I became a Christian in graduate school and got involved in apologetics. And actually, I just published my first book on apologetics with Crossway. It came out last month. But if you buy that hoping you'll hear about critical theory, you'll be disappointed. Because that was written, I probably finished the first draft 4 years ago. And then when I finished the book, I began looking around for other areas of research. And I thought, what's happening with all this woke stuff that I kind of hear, Black Lives Matter? What's going on in our culture? And so I began reading a lot about something called critical theory, which, as you said, it spans many critical social theories that include queer theory, critical race theory, critical pedagogy. And it's kind of a framework that a lot of theorists use to understand social dynamics today. And so now I'm here to talk to you guys, I guess, about one of those expressions of critical theory, which is queer theory.
Yeah, I think that I want to encourage everyone to go check out Neil's website, Shenvy Apologetics, and you will be able to benefit from his many, many book reviews. He really does a great job.
You must read like a book an hour. I'm like, I don't know.
Studying and reading the primary sources, and has really inspired us in so many ways to be diligent about reading those first sources and inspiring others. So thank you for setting such a good example for us, Neil. And as we talk about queer theory tonight, just digging in deeper, because this, I think, is the part of the critical social theories is really on the rise.
Yeah. I actually wanted to give a shout out because many people have heard me talk about Pat Sawyer, who was like extremely pivotal in our conversations and me coming out of critical race theory. And that is actually Neil's writing partner, if people don't know that. And so there's a connection all the way around.
Yeah.
But yes, the queer theory and just, I call it an indoctrination into our schools, into churches, into like just like you said, the normalization of just everyday life. This extends beyond like a drag queen story hour into what we've talked about before. To me, the comprehensive sexual education, which to me is founded in a lot of the queer theory. But can you help us by defining queer theory first of all, so that we all have a foundational understanding of what we're talking about tonight?
So one of the undisputed characteristics of queer theory is that it's hard to define. So here's one of the, I think the best book on queer theory out there that I've read is Jagoz's Queer Theory and Introductions, right here. And it chapter 1, page 1 says, queer is very much a category in the process of formation. Its definitional indeterminacy, its elasticity is one of its constituent characteristics. So it's almost definedly undefined. I found this, here's a website. This is the University of Illinois Chicago website. It says, queer theory is both theory and political action. Definition is impossible. So, okay, right off the bat, when people say, "Oh, you can't even define it," well, like no one can define it. But the website goes on. This is a very helpful definition in one sentence. They say queer theory can be summarized as exploring the oppressive power of dominant norms, particularly those relating to sexuality, and the immiseration they cause. That means they cause oppression, they cause misery to those who cannot or do not wish to live according to those norms. In analyzing the power of the normal, in quotes, queer theory contributes to a politics and ethics of difference. It challenges dominant norms, especially those of sexuality. That's a great little tight paragraph talking about what's the major theme of queer theory. I put it this way. Queer theory is, its goal is to expose and to destabilize and to trouble all traditional categories, norms, ways of thinking, even language about gender and sexuality. That's one sentence. It's trying to trouble and destabilize everything about these categories of gender, sexuality.
And that's really where the kind of the rise of the drag queens, I think, comes in, is that it's part of that destabilization of the traditional norm, what we would call the biblical norm of gender expression and biological sex. And I think that that's one of the reasons why it's important to have this conversation, is to understand everything and put it in context.
Well, yeah. And it's just, we'll go there, but I got to get this book out. So this is another great book on queer theory called Queer Theory, Gender Theory by Ricky Wilkins. And let me read, because you mentioned drag. This is this will blow your mind. So believe it or not, I don't know. We'll get this later too. I'm gonna refer to the author as Wilkins. I'm genuinely not entirely sure what the author's sex is. But this is a quote from the book. On page 146, Wilkins says this. This is a direct quote. The author's summarizing the thought of Judith Butler, who's one of the founders of queer theory. So the author's summarizing Butler's thought and says this: woman, the word woman, is to drag, not as real as to copy. It's not like woman is real and drag is copy. It's not that. But as copy is to copy. Gender turns out to be a copy for which there is no original. Listen to this sentence. All gender is drag. All gender is queer. But it's not, they're simply saying that these categories that are traditional, we've gotten them wrong. These categories of male and female are wrong. Here are the right categories. They're not saying that. They're saying all gender is just a copy with no original. All gender is just in this arbitrary construction. There's either, here's another statement from the book. We might as well declare that there are only 2 genders, or 100, or even none, because gender is entirely constructed. These are not just statements of reality, they're political statements as well. They serve certain agendas. They empower or erase certain bodies. That's page 99 of the book, Queer Theory, Gender Theory. So the point is, it goes way beyond, we got these categories wrong. The underlying premise, the underlying worldview of queer theory is that these categories don't really exist except as our constructions, and we can, therefore, it's actually almost in a way good to transgress them and expose the way they're just arbitrary.
I want to say a quick comment, and then Monique's going to jump to a question. I want to caution everyone in making comments on YouTube. Help us not get censored by making crazy comments. Please don't make a lot of comments that will cause YouTube to ban this video. Okay, so please use care and discretion in what you're saying in the comments.
Yes.
If you have a legitimate question, that's fine, but please do not just have off the cuff comments, because I don't want this video to get messed up once we sign off.
Good thought.
All right.
Yeah, and so if you notice that our moderators have taken off your comment, it isn't, don't take it personal. It's just that we want to make sure that the video is able to be used as a resource for others and isn't flagged by YouTube. And YouTube can be sensitive about certain things. So, gosh, a lot of what you said in the definition, or lack of definition, regarding queer theory made me think about, especially with this like disheveling of society, or what I would consider like a transformation of society, made me think a lot of critical race theory. Now, Krista and I tend to say that critical race theory is a part of critical theory, and all of the social theories are tied together like a train. They are, like links on a chain, and you can't really unlink one and just take one by itself. Can you
to be an ally for one is to be an ally for all.
Yeah, and that's really Kendi's model.
Yeah.
Kendi, says you can't be anti-racist without being a feminist, or without standing for the queer movement and things like that. And I'm not quoting him directly, but
I can quote him directly. I
go
have it right
ahead
in front
now.
of me.
Come on, cousin. Come on through.
So really your question
I came
is
prepared.
giving us examples of the interconnection.
How are they connected? Like, do you see them as being connected? And if so, how do you see them as being connected?
There are many ways. So historically, there are 4 sort of major influences that produced queer theory today. And this is, so at a very simple level, you'd say that critical theory is the umbrella. And critical theory understands society is divided into categories of oppressor and oppressed, along lines of race, of all these different categories: race, class, gender, sexuality, physical ability, etc. And it tries to expose how oppression's embedded in ideas. Oppression is not just cruelty or overt malice and animus, but oppression's embedded in language, in symbols, in norms, in values. And so there are these ideas like, so the patriarchy would be the idea that masculine is superior to feminine. It would create this hierarchy of men are better than women. Then you have white supremacy is this ideology of racial superiority where whites are better than people of color. Then you have things like heteronormativity, where heterosexuals are the oppressor group and LGBTQ people are the oppressed group. And so if you think about that view, all these critical social theories take that perspective and then apply it in different areas. So critical race theory applies that perspective to race. Queer theory applies it to sexuality. Feminism applies it to gender. Critical pedagogy applies to education. That's one way to think about it. But all of these fields really have their unique origins too, and so draw on different sources. So, for example, here's one departure in a sense. Queer theory also draws heavily on, so besides critical theory, which came out of the Frankfurt School and Marxism before that, but queer theory also draws a lot on 3 other sources. One is feminism, second wave feminism. 2 is the gay liberation movement of the 60s. And 3, which is very important, is postmodernism. So Derrida and Foucault are uniformly cited as sort of the huge figures behind queer theory. And there are influential in some critical race theory, some of it, but they're not like the founders. Whereas I would argue that Foucault is in some sense, he's like the Derek Bell of queer theory. So Derek Bell's like the godfather of critical race theory. He was like he was the forerunner of it. He didn't really create it, but all his ideas really produced it. And then Foucault, you could argue, particularly his book, The History of Sexuality, was the godfather of queer theories. The point is, it's kind of simplistic to be like, okay, there's this one broad way of thinking about the world, critical theory, and it's expressed into these different areas, because each discipline is kind of more complicated than that. But at a first order approximation, that's pretty good. I'm sorry, I have quotes for you. So
Yeah, go ahead with the quotes.
Here are the quotes. So Kendi, his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, page 159, he says, anti-racist policies cannot eliminate class racism without anti-capitalism policies. Anti-capitalism cannot eliminate class racism without anti-racism. On page 189, he says, to truly be anti-racist is to be feminist. To truly be feminist is to be anti-racist. And then on page 187, he says, we cannot be anti-racist if we are homophobic or transphobic. To be queer anti-racist is to understand the privileges of my cisgender, my masculinity, of my heterosexuality, of their intersections. And again, people will say, well, that's just Kendi. He's not really doing critical race theory. Well, let me hit you with another quote. This is from Kimberly Crenshaw, who is one of the co-founders of critical race theory. She coined the term intersectionality. She coined the term critical race theory. And she says this in 1990, so pretty much 1 year after critical race theory really emerged as a movement, roughly, right? She says this in her article entitled A Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Law and Politics. She says, critical race theory goes beyond liberal understandings of race and racism by exploring those of its manifestations that support, listen, her list, patriarchy, heterosexism, and class stratification. The normative stance of critical race theory is that massive social transformation is a necessary precondition of racial justice. And she'll go on to repeat that same claim with three other co-authors in the book Words That Wound. Matsuda, Lawrence, and Delgado and Crenshaw wrote that anthology in 1993. Again, a few years. They're all co-founders of CRT, and they again say that a defining element of CRT is that racial oppression, I'll quote, racial oppression is experienced by many in tandem with oppression on grounds of gender, class, or sexual orientation. And therefore, they say the interests of all people of color necessarily require not just adjustments within established hierarchies, but a challenge to hierarchy itself.
Wow.
I could go on, but I'll leave it there. But the point is, when people are like, oh, these are just separate, these are totally esoteric academic fields, not related at all. You're listening to Chris Rufo. You're listening to scaremongering people on Fox News. I'm like, no, I'm listening to Kimberly Crenshaw. I'm listening to the founders of the movement, and this is what they're saying.
I think that's really important to put out there because, that's often the claim is, well, queer theory isn't actually in the public schools. Nobody's teaching school children, about Matsuda and that sort of thing. But these ideas in practice are shaping a lot of things that are happening in schools. We've been talking about how it's coming in through social emotional learning, and it comes under that rubric of mental health. So there's different ways that it comes in, but this is largely what is shaping the praxis of many of our public spaces now. Now we've been using a couple of words I think need some additional definition, is sex and gender. Sometimes those words are kind of used interchangeably. It would be really helpful for us to understand how people in the queer theory stream parse out the definitions of those terms.
Sure. So queer theory would definitely distinguish between sex, which is a biological category, and gender, which they see as a social construct, as purely a social construct. Let me just read to you from Wilkins' book, page 40 and 41. I'll just refer to, again, I think he's a biological male, but I don't know. So I'm just going to say Wilkins. Gender, this is a quote, gender is a language, a system of meanings and symbols, along with the rules, privileges, and punishments pertaining to their use. For power and sexuality, masculinity and femininity, strength and vulnerability, action and passivity, dominance and weakness. The point is, gender is a language. Gender is a system of symbols and meanings. It's something that we have built. Here's another quote from Judith Lorber's essay, Night to His Day. She writes, Western society's values legitimate gendering. It's something you do, it's an action, by claiming that it all comes from physiology, female and male procreative differences. But gender and sex are not equivalent, and gender as a social construction does not flow automatically from genitalia and reproductive organs, the main physiological differences of females and males. And then again, Anderson and Collins and Race, Class, and Gender, right? Gender, listen to this, is a great, listen to it. Gender, like race, is a socially constructed experience, not a biological imperative. Sex refers to one's biological identity as male or female. Gender refers to the systematic structuring of relationships between women and men in social institutions. Gender is a learned identity, but as with race, it cannot be understood at the individual level alone. So gender is sort of like these categories we've created, and by which we structure society into, the men on the top and women who are a marginalized group. And so gender refers to that system that we've created, not to biological facts. That's their view. They're just distinct. There's sex and there's gender.
So the sex is the biology. It is how, we are created. As the Bible would say, male and female. Mm. But queer theory comes along and kind of separates out the biology or the sex from the gender. Mm-hmm. And they would say that the gender is how you express yourself or how you appear or how you live. And that is the social construct. That being a woman or being a man is kind of subject to almost whatever you want that to be. And so maybe we should talk about like some practical examples of how this is showing up in the culture and that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, more analogy here. It's kind of helpful. And the one thing that's important is they don't just say that sex and gender are different. They say that they're trying to trouble. Queer theory is all about troubling these categories and showing them and dismantling them and showing they're arbitrary. So here's a good analogy. Imagine that we as a culture, we defined a jock to be anyone who's taller than 6 feet, and a nerd refers to anyone who is shorter than 6 feet tall. Now, there is a biological reality there. People are either over 6 feet tall or under 6 feet tall. That's biology. That's just you can measure it. It's objective. But then the category of jock or nerd that we've created are arbitrary, putting people in buckets. Like, well, you're over 6 feet tall, you're a jock. You're under 6 feet tall, you're a nerd. Well, that's arbitrary. Why 6 feet? Why not 5'11"? Why not 6'1"? And why not? What about weight? What if you really are tall but very skinny? Are you still a jock? So what queer theory does is trying to expose the ways in which these categories of male and female don't even really, not only are they socially constructed, but they're arbitrary. They're blurry areas and gray areas and blurry lines. So they make you question then by pointing that out. And this is why you have things like drag queens and also people pointing at intersex individuals who have both male and female characteristics due to a variety of genetic conditions. They're pointing those out in order to trouble you, to make you think, oh, it's not as black and white as I thought, and to point out these are really arbitrary constructs. So that explains why they're going a bit. That's why people are trying to, even you'll see discussion now, I should add this, queer theorists don't just contest the idea of gender as a social, they actually will go farther and say that sex, biological sex, is also in some sense a social construct. So this is incredible. So Judith Butler, again, I'd say almost a founder of queer theory. She says, well, does it seem like that biological sex is, in her words, on the far side of language? Like, in other words, you either have XX chromosomes or XY chromosomes. It's not about how you describe it with language. It's not about words. It's about a reality that's out there beyond the effects of culture. But so then Wilkins asks, but what if sex is already a gendered way of looking at bodies? What if sex is already gender? So that distinction between the two is not a distinction at all. What is sex, the original given, transcendent, and universal? What if that could be deconstructed? So here's like, how could you deconstruct chromosomes? Well, here's the point. If I close my eye, I'm a guy. Maybe this is different, but if I close my eyes, you probably couldn't even tell me what color my eyes were. Like you don't look at me and be like, oh yeah, he has blue eyes, he has green eyes, he has brown eyes, and they're brown, right? But I don't know. I don't look around looking and know, oh, that person is a blue eye. That person is a brown eye. Or what about earlobes? Like, are your earlobes detached or are they attached? Earlobes differ a little bit. No one cares. It's just a little flap of skin. You're like, I don't look around. I don't categorize people by earlobe type. Well, their point is we have this fixation with certain flaps of skin. We call them penises. We call them vaginas. But what makes those things so relevant? Why do we immediately look at someone? Oh, they have a penis. Like, well, we don't look at someone and say they have blue eyes. They have a detached earlobe. So their point is, yes, sure, there are these things out there on our bodies, but why do we group whole sets of bodies according to this one? Why not use their big toe? Why not use their ear? Why not use their eye color? Well, because gender is basically gender and sex are interrelated. They're both in some sense constructs. Why we care about some parts and not others is because there's this cultural fixation that's produced by, again, these social hierarchies. Anyway, so the point is that they're not even saying, we're not limiting our deconstruction to just gender. They're even going in and saying, let's deconstruct sex too.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's new for me. So would that account for why it's okay to engage in sex change, like physical steps of sex change, even though the XX chromosomes and XY chromosomes don't change? We're just merely rearranging skin, if you will. And so is that kind of the intellectual foundation for engaging in all of these hormone treatments and operations and surgeries and taking out people's reproductive organs?
So it's sort of that. It's interesting that I think queer theorists would actually would not necessarily be full-throatedly in favor of things like sex change surgery, whatever you want to call it, sex reassignment surgery, but they would not necessarily know why. Not because they'd be against it, but because they're saying the real problem is we're still working within this gender binary. You're still being like, oh, you wanted to change from what? Mm-hmm. From male to female. They're like, that's the problem. You, even by saying I'm going to change from male to female, you're still reinforcing those two categories. We must destroy the categories. We have to have no gender, or we have to have 100 genders. We shouldn't even buy into the idea that there are these two genders. Yeah. So I think queer theorists might even trouble them. They'd say, wait a minute, without intending to, you're actually reinforcing this cultural illusion that there's either male or female. That's why drag becomes so important, because it is deliberately blurring these lines and saying what's a drag performer is sort of doesn't fit into these buckets. That's exactly the point. They're showing they are troubling the narrative of this gender binary, and they're showing that it's socially constructed. And they revel in the kind of transgressive transition of the gender binary. Queer theorists do.
So in thinking about some practical real world examples, Monique and I recently were on a trip. I can't remember what airport it was, but there was a person helping us return our rental car, and on roller skates with a beard, but female anatomy and long hair.
And fairy ears.
Little,
yeah.
It was, and so that is an example, I think, of what you're saying, of like neither male nor females, like Monique said, beards and a beard and boobs. Like right. It didn't go together.
And I feel like I see that a lot more as we travel. You know, man, like we were in everything happens in the airport, but we were at another airport and there was a man. Oh, it wasn't even in the airport. It was down the street when we went out. And I won't say the name of the place, but there was a guy wearing like stiletto heels and a full beard, but everything else was feminine.
Yeah.
It's like this deconstruction of sex into you, like it's just fluid. I can be whatever I want to be.
And I should make it clear, I don't, just like in the same way that critical race praxis is in our culture, in our schools, that no one's, 95% of the US has not read Crenshaw, even D'Angelo. I mean, only a tiny fraction of people actually read these theorists, but the ideas are very easy to grasp. Like once you're like, oh, there's no gender, it's all made up. Oh, fine, then this is why in fact, I should revel in just breaking down these stereotypes. And then there's a much larger discussion about, well, why do we have the sense the internal gender identity is how I feel, how I view myself, gender identity. Gender expression is how I choose to express that externally, and that can depend on every person. They can say, I'm going to express my gender in this way, I'm going to express my gender in this way. Then there's gender norms, which are cultural values. Culture thinks you should express your gender this way. And then there's sexual orientation, who I'm attracted to. So there are all these different axes, but the central governing one is this secret sacred self. I think Carl Truman calls it that. He has a great book, which I'll recommend later, called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And basically asks the question, philosophically, how do we come to be a culture that even has this idea of gender identity, or the idea that I'm a man trapped in a woman's body? Where'd that even come from? So he goes way back to like the Romantic period and philosophers from the last 200 years, and explains how we got to the place where our inner sense of self determines everything about our lives. Not we don't try to conform our lives to external reality. Rather, we try to conform external reality to my secret sacred self. But it's an excellent book. But that explains why. But my point is, the average person on the street is not like, oh, why am I doing this? Let me quote to you some Judith Butler, Gender Trouble, page 37. They're just going with the cultural flow.
Right. Now, I want to give a quick plug here, and our moderators can put this in the comments. We did an interview with our friend, Dr. Aaron Preston from Valparaiso University about a year and a half ago on postmodernism.
Yeah.
And it's a whole deep dive into things that Neil is only alluding to in deconstruction and all of this stuff. So if you want to know more about postmodernism and all of that, what that is, if the moderators can find that episode, I remember it has the word "my truth" in the title of the episode, and that would be a good one to also as an adjunct to this. Also, our review, Neil's discussion that we had with him a while back on Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, would also be relevant here. So our moderators can put that in the chat. Neil, Monique wants to go some other questions, but I don't want to miss out on, as we're talking about real-time practical examples, to talk about some of these graphics that you sent over, because I think this will continue to illustrate, what we're talking about here with sex and gender.
Yeah, so can you put up the slide number 1? So this is a slide, actually I used it just a year ago. It's called the gender-bred person. If you look at it, it shows that they're in these 4 axes. You have the gender identity, your sense of self. You have your sexual orientation, your heart, who you're attracted to. You have your sex, your biological sex, which is, again, your genitals, basically. Then you have expression, so how you choose to express your sense of self externally, what you wear, how you act, etc. Now, this is important. This is a slide. I literally pulled this off of a website. It's a very popular website. And notice that there are these continuum, there's spectrums. There's a gender spectrum, gender identity spectrum, gender expression spectrum, biological sex spectrum, orientation spectrum. This it ranges from, say, male on the one side to female on the other side, with intersex in the middle. You have sexual orientation. You could be heterosexual or homosexual. On the middle, there's bisexual. Okay, so I pulled that last July. I know that was online last July. The next slide. This is gender-bred person 4.0. That was like 1.0. This is 4.0. It's already been read 4 times. But the top part, I'm ignoring that because it's the same. The picture is the same. Look how they've changed. Notice there's no longer one line with male and female and then intersex in the middle. There's now 2 lines that say things like, maleness and femaleness, and you can be
So it's not a spectrum anymore of men and women on either side. It's
right, because what would happen if you have a spectrum with male and female what are you implicitly saying? There's a binary, male and female.
The binary is true.
But so they're like, whoa, queer theory says you can't do that. You're actually reifying the gender binary. So now gender person 4.0 has these two lines that are each independent. So you can be super male and super female. You can be, so you can express yourself super masculinely and super femininely in the same time, or none at all. You can be, so they had to get rid of that whole idea of even the singular line, even though it's a spectrum, it's still too binary. Next slide. This is interesting. Actually, I knew about this and someone pointed out at the conference. Now, why would you make a gender unicorn? This is a different site, but why gender unicorn? Someone pointed out, well, the gender person still looks like a male. The actual shape of the figure is still masculine, right? So they picked a unicorn. And now, why unicorn? I'm not exactly sure. I think because, again, the unicorn is an imaginary creature. But they're pointing out all of this stuff is in some sense a social construct. It's not imaginary, but it's something that we've made up on our own, like the unicorn. And you're like, well, is that a common thing? This is a book. It's an Italian queer theorist, and this is his book, Queer Theories, an introduction. But it's got a unicorn on the front too. And my kids saw that and they're like, "What's with the unicorn?" I'm like, I don't actually know, but I guess it makes sense if you believe all of this is in some sense made up. All this gender stuff. I mean, not they're saying we've made it up, and we have to get out of this mindset that it's a real thing. But notice now again, not only are there now there are 3 lines under every category because I guess 2 is still too binary, so now you've got a 3rd line, a way to express your gender expression, gender identity, etc. Anyway, so it's interesting to see the evolution of this. Just even this figure that it wasn't, even in July 2021. The 1.0 gender person was not woke enough. And now gender unicorn, I'm sure we're going to see. Actually, I did the same thing with the pride flags for the book that I'm currently writing. I went through the evolution of pride flags. It's really interesting to look at how the pride flags have changed from the rainbow flag to like the current flag that includes like 10 colors and a triangle. Anyway, it's too much, more than you know.
Now, I want to kind of get away from the script or the questions that I actually sent over. Sorry, Neil.
Okay.
But as apologists and you guys who are, and I'm not saying that I won't answer this, but you guys are also parents. I have 2 questions. My first question is, what do you think the implications are for a culture that moves away from any idea of true sex? Because I think that's the goal. Like we're getting away from the idea that God has created man and woman. If we can say that sex itself is a social construct, what do you do with Genesis 1? What do you think the implications of that are? And this is a question for both of you.
So you're asking, like, what are the long-term, what do we see as like the long-term projections as the culture adopts all of these kind of gender spectrum, multiple spectrums framework?
Yeah.
What do we see as kind of the long-term impacts of that on the culture?
From like a Christian point, like what do you see as being that long run implication of basically, I mean, you guys can disagree with me and tell me maybe that's not true, but like one of the people in the chat mail, she said it's like us playing God or replacing God. Is that how you would see it? Do you see it as we're either replacing or playing God? And what is going to be the long-term, I feel like, implication of a society biblically? Like, can we even look at it like from a biblical standpoint? Like, what are we in for? Is it possible to know that?
I'll let Neil take a whack at that first, and then.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're just going to see a lot of broken people. It's going to things are going to break. And I think you're already seeing that to some extent. Even I was going to recommend people follow some detransitioners. These are people that have transitioned from their birth gender to some other gender and then decided they made a big mistake and came back. And there's a growing community of people that now we're seeing that because in the transgender boom really happened within the last 5 years, and you can see the data, just humongous referrals to gender clinics and gender surgery and hormone prescriptions have all boomed in the last 5 years. And then in the wake of that boom, you're also seeing then there's some people saying, wait, that was a terrible mistake. And there are really tragic stories of people they're saying, I've just done permanent damage to my body, and why didn't anyone stop me? I was 15, I was 16, I was depressed.
Nobody had a conversation with me. Nobody tried to put the brakes on it. They just affirmed me and went forward. You're hearing more and more of those stories among detransitioners.
And I think just beyond that too, I think that the more this becomes prevalent in society, I think you're going to have people that just have never had any concept of a healthy relationship with their own self, a healthy family, a healthy sexuality, anything. It's all going to be completely, they have no reference frame of this is, and then they're not going to be able to say this is a normal, healthy family relationship, body, etc. And why won't they be able to say that? Because that's the whole point of queer theory. The whole point of queer theory is to show that the idea of normalcy and health is all an oppressive social construct. And if they succeed in doing that, as Christians, we like, well, there is such a thing as a healthy, God-ordained, correct, God-glorifying family and sexuality and relationship to your body and all those things. There is a real norm out there that's God-ordained. If you get rid of that, well, if you get rid of God's way of viewing reality, you embrace chaos and ultimately your own destruction. So anyway, I don't want to make, predictions about society. I just say the people are going to be hurting. And I think Christians then should, with truth and love, say we want to, just embody health. We want to show people, no, you can have a happy, loving family. You can have happy, loving relationships. You can be happy in your body. You can be, even when your body is not quote unquote normal. There's a legitimacy in critique. Queer theory will critique things like standards of beauty, and I think it's fair. As Christians, we should be like, yeah, you don't have to look like some porn star on TV with humongous exaggerated breasts, and no, you can be a just normal average woman and be happy with that. You can be a normal average man. You can be disabled. You can have. You don't have to be. You can just glorify God by living in the body He's given you and be content. And I think whereas I think our culture, for many different reasons, not just queer theory, pornography is telling you, no, be discontent. You're not okay. You're not good the way you are. You need to get better. And I think we can say, no, we have a way to get contentment and joy just by living in the body and the world God's created.
Yeah, I totally agree with Neil. I think I would just add to that I would love to see churches positioning themselves even now for how they are going to minister to detransitioners or to people who take the trans idea and the ideals of homosexuality all the way to the end of the road, and they realize this actually doesn't lead to the freedom I thought I was going to get. We're going to have a lot of people very soon who have done things to their body, fairly severe things, that they're going to be hurting, confused. They need the gospel. They need hope. They need a better a modeling for a better way, and for that contentment and a vision for what their life can become on the other side of these choices. And I would love to see more churches have some forward thinking of how are we going to position ourselves even now to reach out to these people and in this community, rather than just saying, oh, this is weird and peculiar and deviant, which, we can have the conversation about the sadness of this, but, how are we going to respond? Right now, we just have so many Christians, quite frankly, who have been brainwashed by the culture, to use the word of my 23-year-old this morning on this issue, is that there's just so much brainwashing for young people. I think that she's right about that. And I'm concerned that we have so many people in the name of Jesus affirming of LGBT people affirming them in some ways that aren't helpful. And so, I don't know, those are some thoughts. But also, I think that there's a big conversation happening right now. This is another thing I was talking to my 23-year-old about this morning, is shifts of what it means to be a conservative. You're seeing some data points that conservatives are becoming more and more embracing of the LGBT community. And I think that in a few years, it wouldn't surprise me if biblically faithful Christians find themselves without a political party altogether. Because I don't think it's going to be too much longer that Republicans are going to be continuing to affirm traditional marriage. I think they're already showing signs of embracing the queer agenda. And I think that very soon, biblically faithful Christians are just going to find themselves like there's no party that they can kind of go along with. That's a theory. I wouldn't die for that, but that's, if you're asking me to prognosticate, there's my prognostic.
Prognosticate. Go ahead, girl. All right. Yeah, I was just wondering, as you guys look out, what you guys see as some of the implications, because I don't know that people are looking far in advance or, beyond their moment of today or what's happening in their kid's school. But, what's happening in your child's school regarding queer theory is definitely going to have an impact 25 years from today. And, I wonder if we consider that at all, or, the drag queen story hour, the implications of that drag queen story hour are going to have ripples.
Yeah.
And it's just really important for us to be considering, and being future forward. How are we looking forward into some of that? So
I want to ask Neil, as we kind of wrap up here, I feel like queer theory is still very much in the academic realm. Is there anything that we could read as lay people that would provide us some kind of onboarding to the major ideas behind queer theory?
Yeah, I don't think it's at all relegated to the academic realm. I think the praxis is everywhere. And so just if you want to know what queer theory looks like in practice, just log on to any LGBTQ organization, the Human Rights Campaign, Pink News. You get undiluted gender and queer theory. Queer theory in its purest form. Sure, there are these academics writing these incomprehensible papers, but their ideas are boiled down and simplified and then put out everywhere. So all the Blue's Clues was a preschool oriented show. It's a cartoon show with a dog or something, but they had a Pride Month cartoon that had a pride parade, and one of the characters was a beaver with a double mastectomy scar. There you go. There's the sun. And so this are targeted at 3 to 7 year olds, I think. And the lyrics and the drag queen sang a song to the tune of the Ants Go Marching, and the lyrics were things like, "These Babas are non-binary. They love each other so proudly, and they all go marching in the big pride parade. Ace, bi, and pan grown-ups, that's asexual, bisexual, and pansexual grown-ups you see can love each other so proudly, and they all go marching in the big pride parade." So again, the double mastectomy scar. I mean, this is for preschoolers, and this is just becoming so normal. I mean, for most people. So I think you can draw pretty much a straight line from the most lofty esoteric queer theory ideas to Blue's Clues. It's there. So I wouldn't say it's just, but in terms of popular sources, again, I always go say primary sources. I will say the queer theorist writings can be pretty hard to read. They are highly influenced by postmodern authors, and so they're not very clear all the time. But the one book here that I'd recommend is accessible, I think, is Wilkins' book, Queer Theory, Gender Theory. And Wilkins is an activist, ran the Gender PAC, but definitely is heavily promoting, and very easy to understand.
So that's a book we want to make sure everybody understands. It's called Queer Theory, Gender Theory. It's not a Christian book. It's pro queer theory book. So if you want to understand as a primary source, that would be something to refer people to.
Yeah,
and if you look at it, go ahead.
was going to say for well, another as a non-Christian source, but it's definitely in a non-queer theory affirming source, is Abigail Schreier's book Irreversible Damage. This is a really good one that I would recommend giving to friends, non-Christian friends who are super progressive and LGBTQ affirming all the way. Give them Abigail Schreier's book Irreversible Damage. It's about the rapid rise in female to male transgenders among teenage girls. And she asks, what is going on with all these girls suddenly demanding testosterone and double mastectomies and hysterectomies? Why is that happening? And then she goes and interviews parents. She interviews doctors and then tries to and says what's happening. And so it's a really good book to make people just maybe at least pump the brakes on like what's going on here. And we're already seeing that actually in the UK. They just closed the Tavistock Gender Clinic because they're really beginning to see that some of these practices are not safe. Even from a purely secular perspective, they're giving kids drugs. They're doing things without a lot of proper protocols. So they shut down. I think they just shut down the clinic. So we're beginning to see, hopefully, even a secular backlash, which is my mind boggles at Christians who are trying to be on the cutting edge. I'm like, you're not on the cutting edge. Maybe you're on the wrong side of history, because people are realizing this is super. Bill Maher had a monologue. Bill Maher is like an atheist progressive, but had a monologue on his show about what in the world is going on. This is not sane that we have 20% of Generation Z identifying as LGBTQ. It's a humongous rise. Suddenly, where'd that come from? Anyway, so that's another. For Christian books, I think the number one resource I would give is Nancy Pearcey's Love Thy Body. She's a professor at, I think, Houston Baptist University. But Pearcey's Love Thy Body is a holistic book about a Christian doctrine of the body. Really good. Talks about transgender, talks about sexuality, talks about all these different issues. That's good. Another one is Andrew Walker's book, God and the Transgender Debate. God and the Transgender Debate. It's mainly about transgender, but it's very practical. Like, how do you think about it as a Christian? And then this is okay. The book I've read, which I loved, Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's very good. It's a little academic. He's a historian. It's excellent, though. It traces the ideas for the last 300 years that led to transgender today.
There is now an abbreviated version of that book.
Yeah.
Called Strange New World.
Yes.
So I've not read that one, but
all right. Sorry. Regarding the queer theory book, I want to make sure that people know I think you might have a older version of the Queer Theory Gender Theory by Wilkins, because it's a different cover. Still the same book.
I have the third edition, so it's gone through. But I mean, it's funny because Wilkins is not like an academician that I can tell, but I think it's already gone through 3 editions. And if you look at it, like, it's one of the top recommended books.
Okay.
So I think so. The other one, I guess, Jago's is the more academic one. I actually found this less helpful. It's more academic and scholarly, but I found this much more practical. So, and there are other ones that I've read too, but those are the
good
two
to know.
that I think. Yep.
Now, I have a question, and this is not in the question, so if you don't want to comment on it, it's okay because you haven't prepped for it. But I've seen some posts on Twitter, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about this, that some people are suggesting that there's latent in queer theory the idea of desensitizing children to pedophilia, and that there is potentially some connection there with redefining even sex and sexual partners as a social construct. Have you run across anything like that in your readings on queer theory?
Absolutely. So that is, so Michel Foucault was a pedophile. I mean, he just was. He was like this huge postmodern philosopher, but he was a pedophile. And so that if your whole purpose, and I'm not saying just because he's a pedophile, therefore no, but I'm saying that was his whole philosophy of breaking down norms and exposing their just power plays or social constructs. Well, one norm obviously is as an age norm. Like you shouldn't engage in sex acts between adults and children. Well, what's child? That's a total 18, 16, 14. How come it's rape when it's a 20-year-old and a 15-year-old, but not when it's a 15-year-old and a 14-year-old, and not when it's a 35-year-old and 25-year-old, because it's 10-year gap. So his point is like, yeah, you're going to destabilize those notions. So did that carry over into queer theory? The ideas of destabilizing all of these different categories. Well, yeah. So here's a quote from Jagos, that academic book. She talks about, this is I'm going to read a long quote here, so no one can accuse me of quote mining. Variously referred to as intergenerational sex, child abuse, man-boy love, and pedophilia. Even the semantic continuum of terms used to describe the concept evokes a variety of positions in the debate, structured overwhelmingly by such issues as consent, power, and legal definition of childhood. Legal definition of childhood. When's the age of consent, right? It's a legal construct. So you're saying that, all these terms, they refer to the same concept, but, one sounds pejorative, pedophilia, another sounds intergenerational sex, man-boy love. Now, she says, this is a quote, the issue of intergenerational sex, which tells you what term she's using, continues to be debated vigorously in many gay and lesbian communities. The protection of children is deemed by some to be ethically crucial, that's good, to the development of a gay identity, but is dismissed as others as erotic hysteria. Okay, I'm going to keep going. What is the status of different and arbitrary age of consent laws? Do children have a sexuality and a right to sexual agency, a right to choose their partners? A child? Why don't they? Why don't you give them freedom? Listen to this. Why is age, unlike, say, race or class, understood as a sexualized power differential protected by law? Think about that. We don't say, there's in the mind of critical theorists, the black and white relationship is one of power differential, power dynamics. Whites are on top, blacks are on the bottom, whites have power, blacks don't, whites are oppressors. But we would never say, well, you can't have an interracial sex is bad inherently because there's a power dynamic. Class, rich and poor, richer on top, poor on the bottom, richer oppressors, poor. But you never say, if you have sex with a rich person, your wife's poor, well, therefore it's unethical. Well, no, it's not a powered. It's not. But there's a law saying interracial sex is illegal. Interclass sex is illegal. Mm-hmm. So then, why is interage sex illegal? Mm-hmm. She's asking why treat it differently. They're all power differentials, right? And the last question she's asking this question as an open question. Is it possible to eroticize children in an ethical way? Now, here's how she concludes all those questions. These are the questions commonly raised and by no means yet resolved in the controversy over intergenerational sex. So this is like very academic, very neutral, and she's a queer theorist, but she's just saying, this is a debate among queer theorists whether or not intergenerational sex can be ethical. Can you eroticize children in an ethical way? That's an open question.
And refresh our memory again on what book you were reading from there.
That was Anne-Marie Jagot's Queer Theory and Introduction, pages 70 and 71. And it's on my website. I think the entire paragraph is on my website. But it's pretty shocking, but it's just that's just the way queer theorists think about these issues. It's not so by any means decided.
That explains why I'm seeing more and more on Twitter this idea that the idea of protecting a child's innocence is simply a social construct. Mm-hmm. That's why it's okay to take a 6-year-old to a drag queen story hour, because we need to destabilize their sexuality and awaken it in a safe, quote unquote, safe way, so that eventually, and this is some of the tweets I've seen, is so that the child can begin to choose their sexual partners, right, with the idea that potentially the child could choose an adult as a sexual partner. And so you're trying to deconstruct, if you will, the age of consent. And so this is why, again, we can have 4-year-olds choosing their sex in potentially, eventually, I think what's down the road is 4-year-olds choosing their own sexual partners. And, which could lead to all kinds of interesting predatory conversations. But
I think this is a lot of what I've read in social justice work on child studies and ageism.
Yeah, of course.
And yeah, looking at ageism from the point of, because ageism runs the spectrum of like, what are we doing with the elderly, but looking at ageism from the child and youth perspective, the conversation of consent and what it means to consent and why and when a child should have the ability to consent. It's a big conversation that's happening that I don't think people are aware of behind the scenes. But the critical child studies and what does it mean to be a child, and is childhood even a social construct or an arbitrary term? Just it moves so fluidly in the paragraph you just read.
And I think the point is it once you accept the premise, all of these norms, none of them are God ordained, none of them are universal. They're all, negotiated in our culture as expressions of power. They're all meant to justify the social hierarchy. All of them, not just a few. They're all just arbitrary. There's no God's eye view of reality. There's no God ordained norm. Well, that means means all. They mean even things like childhood innocence, all of that's just your own prejudices and stereotypes. And you have to begin to, you're valorizing the destabilization of these arbitrary constructs. And I hate to say this, but like you want to do that when it comes to things like race. Well, that's all just a construct, all of these quote unquote, the white values and the Eurocentric values, without even asking, well, maybe some of those quote unquote white values are actually God's values, maybe some, not all, I'm just saying some. But if you, no, they're all just social constructs. Where do you stop when you've already pronounced all these norms are social constructs? And they themselves will tell you the same reasoning is being applied to race, to class, to gender, to sexuality, and to age.
Can you spell the last name of the author from Queer Theory, the White Book?
Yeah, I don't know how to pronounce her name. She's Australian, but goes Jagose. Jagose.
Thank you.
That's great. Now, at the beginning of the show, we had a thoughtful question from Tiana, who's a newer listener. And she was asking the question, what does it mean to be a drag queen and why is it sinful? Hopefully, Tiana, we've answered that question throughout this whole show. And I've had your question in mind as Neil and Monique and I have been talking, because, I think that you're asking the question that many people are asking. And, I hope that you have found this broadcast helpful to bring clarity about the biblical vision of the man and the woman, Genesis 1, that we are made for each other and we are made to procreate. We are made to rule and to reign, and that this is part of the creation mandate. And so when we look at these kinds of disruptions, and we could look at drag queens as being kind of an iconic disruption of God's created order, that's why we're having this conversation. So, Tiana, I hope you found it helpful. Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
Let me just quickly add to that, because I think I want to steel man that argument. So I want to point out that sometimes I think Christians can, in response to wanting to affirm the goodness of God's creation, they can kind of just retreat to what I think actually we could be able to admit are social conventions. So, for example, in our culture, men wear pants generally, and women wear dresses. Sometimes women wear pants, but men don't wear dresses. That's kind of a cultural convention. Now, or skirts, say. Men don't wear skirts. Now, is that a cultural construct? And the answer is yes. Why do I say that? Well, think about it. Ancient Romans wore what? Togas. Scottish men wear kilts. Now, what's a kilt? A kilt's a skirt. It's a Scottish skirt, but it's a skirt. But in their culture, warriors wore that, right? So what you wear as a male or female is culturally dependent. In other cultures, I'm sure that men wear things that look like dresses. And so there's one thing. What about colors? Is blue masculine and pink feminine? Well, not objectively. That's a cultural thing. In the Middle Ages, men would wear pink because pink was like red, and red's the color of war and fire. So that's a cultural thing. So I think we should recognize that actually many of these things, these associations we have with things like what you wear, how you dress, many of things are culturally constructed. Now, the question then becomes, so why is it wrong then for, say, a man to wear a dress? If it's all a cultural, it's like God doesn't say, men, thou shalt wear this. And okay, there's a passage in Leviticus that says if a man cross-dresses, that's punishable by death, in fact. But that's Leviticus. And so today, do we have to follow that law? What's the big deal if it's all a cultural construct? Well, here's the thing. I don't think men should wear dresses. Why? Even though it's a cultural construct. Why? Because when you do that, in our culture, that signifies that you are rejecting that category. You're not just doing it. It's not arbitrary. It's an expression and you're saying to the world, I'm a male, but I want to present myself as a female. So in doing that, you're demonstrating that I'm rejecting God's category. I want to be classified as this other category. And I think as Christians, that's why it's wrong. We want to embrace and say, I love being the way God made me. We want to embrace that. And I think some people really do suffer from gender dysphoria. Some people feel uncomfortable being in the body they're in. They feel like I'm in the wrong body. I should have been born a male or a female. I think it can be a real psychological state. But given that we believe God created our bodies, and that's the reality, then I think as Christians, we then actually work to train ourselves to embrace and rejoice in the way God's created us. We don't rebel against it and say, I reject God's creation and I'm going to embrace a different reality. So that's what I would say. Yes, I affirm many of these things are social constructs or cultural artifacts, and we can still respect them because I want to show people I rejoice in my masculinity, and my wife rejoices in her femininity. Nothing's wrong with that. Last thing, when my son was little, we talked to him about transgender at a pretty young age. We realized it's important for us to get in there first, before the culture does. So he's young. We talked to him, I think he was maybe 7 or 8. We said some boys, feel like and really want to be girls. And he was just shocked. But he said this, and he has 2 younger sisters. He did not say, why would any boy want to be a girl? He didn't say that. What did he say? He said, what's wrong with being a boy? Because he's already he's not thinking, well, girls are bad and boys are good. Who'd want to be a girl? He's thinking in God's categories, which are, well, God created these categories and they're good. What's wrong with being a boy? What's wrong with being a girl? And that's the way a Christian worldview should work, is that even when you don't have, you haven't addressed this issue specifically, you're thinking in God's categories already. These are good things God's created, and we should then rejoice in them, not reject them.
That's very good. And in a few weeks, I want to tell our listeners that in September, we're going to finally have Linda Seiler on the show. And she was actually somebody who lived as a man for several years and has done her doctoral work on gender issues. So we'll be talking about more of the biblical counseling side of the gender conversation in September. She's a campus minister. She works with college students. So she sees this stuff living out all the time in her ministry. Super excited. She's in like my top 5 of people I've wanted to get on the show since the beginning.
Right behind Neil.
Right behind Neil.
That's right.
I know. But she's finally coming on in September. So looking forward to that. So we'll just continue to ride that wave, Neil. I thank you so much for adding value to the show by bringing those comments forward. I think that was really good and very helpful. And Tiana says, yes, this has been very helpful to her. I'll be able to give my son more appropriate answers when he asks about these things. So
yes, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Neil.
Anytime.
So when we will be calling you again.
Okay.
Once a year, you're going to be getting that.
Don't play no games. Yes. We are so grateful for all your wisdom. Thank you for doing the heavy lifting and reading all of them. I'm telling you read like a book an hour. You have to. all the things you put out. It's so needed and so helpful. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're
Talk
welcome.
to you later.
God bless.
Night.
Okay, so we're going to go hear from our friends at Impact 360. Then we're going to come back for a second topic. So we will see you in 90 seconds.
Yes.
Change isn't going to come just because you want it to. Change comes because you are intentionally taking steps to making that change.
I aspire to be someone who continues to build bridges with other cultures and who cultivates a community that's healthy and honoring to the Lord and life-giving.
Now, after the program, I feel like I know what my purpose is and I know what I want to do going out into the world. And had I not had this time to step back and just kind of be patient and be still and just listen, I don't think I would have had that same clarity.
In this world, it's kind of like in a scream contest. Who can scream the loudest and who's going to listen to that person yelling the loudest? And that person should be God, but he's not yelling, he's calling us. My hope going forward to interact with culture is to tell people like, hey, like, be still, listen to this guy, he's calling you home.
Yay, love our friends over at Impact 360 down in Georgia. What is the
Pine Mountain.
Pine Mountain.
Where
Yes.
there's one stoplight.
There's one. Yes. But we love them. Super grateful for their ministry to young people. They have a 1-week intensive for high school students, a 2-week intensive for high school students, a 9-month gap year program, and a master's program for students. And they're really busy impacting young people and influencing young people toward a Christian worldview. What does it mean to actually be a Christian? And how do we consider the issues of our current culture in light of the Christian worldview? So we're there once or twice a year
Our
talking
friends
about
Elisa,
critical race theory.
Elisa Childers, Brett Kunkel.
Yeah.
Uncle Kunkel.
Yeah. I don't know if that's public news, but yes.
So
we're all there and really just working to help young people think through the Christian worldview and look at, these current issues in light of a Christian worldview. Now, the next thing we want to talk about, which is kind of in line with what we were talking with Neil about,
oh boy,
is someone, actually Terrence Williams.
Oh,
out in
Terrence,
Virginia.
this is Terrence's fault.
All Terrence is doing. Terrence sent me an article today, and I was like, I had something else I wanted to talk about the second segment, but this I really thought was just a gem. It is called Paid Menstrual Leave is a workers' rights issue that employers should guarantee.
Now, this intellectual masterpiece appeared in Teen Vogue.
It was in Teen Vogue, and this is why I thought that it was.
With this.
That's why I actually thought that it was amazing and should be talked about, because when we talk about the indoctrination of young people,
brainwashing,
we have to also realize all of the ways that they come for your kid. Like it's not just coming through the school. It's not just in, certain Disney movies, even though Disney is well off the rails. It's
menstrual
coming
leave,
through,
a human right.
It's a human right.
I can't with this.
Okay, as a parent, what do you think the goal would be to put this in a Teen Vogue magazine?
To just start the indoctrination about, well, first of all, defining it as a workers' rights issue to me is like, all right, we need clarity about what is a human right.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so we're starting the indoctrination early and often of redefining
what a
rights.
right is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I also wonder, because the article goes in, gosh, we don't have time to go through the whole article.
And it starts off, very first sentence is it mentions a 12-year-old. Ashley Hubbard got her period at 12 years old. So it's going to pull in the teen kind of people of, hey, you're in an oppressed group. You have a menstrual cycle.
Well, I thought it was interesting that the fourth word is her. Her. Okay, so we are talking about hers.
Are we acknowledging that women are the ones with periods?
Okay, so we aren't talking about the hims. We are talking about the hers. And maybe this person is just using feminine pronouns because she identifies as a woman, or, I don't know if you air quote around a woman. But
I'm so confused.
Now, when we go down a little bit more, the whole argument is why menstruating people, because this is what they are now called. Hubbard is one of millions of people who menstruate. And the rest of the article is about the menstruating people. Parents, I'm highlighting this, and not just parents, but anybody who works with kids and young people.
Don't buy into this language.
Don't allow your children to buy into this. Don't settle for it. Have conversations early and often about what does it mean, one, to be a human person, two, what does it mean to have human rights? What is a right? We had Katie Faust on a couple weeks ago, and one of the best definitions of a human right that I have heard in just like lay terms came from Katie's book, Them Before Us. And in looking at a human right, she defines it as something that is given to us by God before government, prior to government. I have the right to life. we have life before we had the installation of government. And so in looking at this article, it goes on to say
It even
that
calls them menstruators.
well, it
Are
says,
menstruators receiving unfair benefits? Why can't menstruators just use normal 6 days? Why can't you use the word woman?
well, I think that it talks about the added benefit of workers' rights. And one, should I use sick time? Should I not? I thought that was hilarious because one, there's only 16, might be 14 states in the union that offer sick time. One, which is completely, according to this article, injustice. But
So now menstruating is a justice issue?
it is completely a justice issue, which is
I have
why
so
I
many
want to highlight
questions.
this, is that everything falls under this banner of justice. But I also think that
Love your neighbor.
I think that it highlights something else, which is the idea of work.
Yeah.
And do you need to work, or should you be given things? Who says that having sick time is a right? Who says that you getting time off at all is a human right issue? I think that in reading this issue, and again, this is just my opinion that I am wanting to highlight before you guys, to let you know that these kind of things are in your kids. I used to have like the teen magazines and things like that, which is probably just all online now. But there's questions of, should you work? Who should you work for? Or should you just quit if they're not giving you what you want? And you completely have the right to state what you want. And one of the things the last thing that I'll highlight is
It's already a law. It's already a law in Zambia, it says.
But in Zambia, they only get 1 day.
Oh.
So a woman can have 1 day off. It's called a Mother's Day, 1 day off a month, to be able to, if you have cramps or whatever. But it says menstrual leave simply acknowledges that workers live in bodies with different needs, functions, and experiences. To me, that sounds a lot like the difference between a man and a woman. But when we use these arbitrary terms, and when we are getting away from things like Neil was talking about, the definition of what is a man and what is a woman, then you get articles here that can be very confusing. And articles that introduce the idea of, maybe I should work, maybe I shouldn't work. I don't necessarily need to work. And if I do get a job, well, the job should bend toward my wants and desires, not necessarily having a true understanding of what it means to work. So I don't know. I wanted to talk about that a little bit because it was highly interesting to me. I don't know what you're doing.
I'm just reading this. There are so many instances where the bodily autonomy of workers is sidelined in the name of productivity, asking for bathroom breaks, required proof of illness, the attitude that we must work through pain. But workers aren't children to be managed by paternalistic bosses. When it comes to menstruation, there is no reason why workers don't deserve the right to paid leave. I mean, I just dispute the framing of the conversation. It's framing it as if, to use the terms of critical theory, it's almost like this is an oppressive work environment because I need a bathroom break. It's peculiar to me. But anyways, Teen Vogue.
It is, but it's
there to brainwash your children.
It's just a normalization of how you should think about the way you live. On Facebook, Rachel Kerr says, way to encourage women to be weak. And that is the other side of this argument, is that by allowing for, and I mean, this is an argument put forward by women, not, men, but that the argument from some women is that it creates a weak idea of what a woman is, that it's paternalistic. There's just a ton of argument for the other side, but I do think it's very interesting that this is what is being put forward before young people.
Yeah. Do biological males who identify as females get leave? I think you have to be a menstruating person.
You have to be a menstruating person.
But then the non-menstruating people, what are their rights? Like, do they just get left out?
They do.
So it's just too bad, so sad for them.
Yes, but the goal, as we would read through the article, the goal is equity.
Yes, I saw that.
Which, again,
this
all
is
of these
all in the name
redefinitions of
equity.
terms and, biological males who identify as female get leave. No, no. But you would be able to see a man, someone who completely looks like a man, maybe who hasn't had the full gender reassignment surgery, out, for a day or 2 or 7.
So, is that how we could keep women's sports for women only? Only menstruators can be on the team.
Well, there's a...
Do formerly menstruating people get menopause leave?
No, it's very ageist. It's only for a certain group of people.
I think the important point that it raises, which I think is good for us to think about, is how do we define what a right is? Because that to me really is the only important question that this intellectual masterpiece is raising, is what is a right? We need to be conversant about what a right is, because soon everything's going to be right just because you want it. Mm-hmm. And it sounds nice. And
Kate Harrington on Facebook says, how do they check if you're a menstruating person or not then? You know what? And with that's a great comment, and we're just going to leave it there because I can't go into all that. I don't know. It's not my business. All right.
I like your earrings.
Oh my gosh, I like your earrings too. These earrings were...
That was subtle, wasn't it?
Were completely handmade by Erin Erickson. We met a couple of her friends. She wasn't actually able to attend the Women in Apologetics conference down in Florida, but we met a couple of her friends, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, she can't be here. Let's call her on the phone. So we called her, and I found out that she actually made earrings. And
she made us each 4 pairs.
Her friends were wearing them, and I was like, oh my gosh, I love earrings. And so they arrived yesterday or day before, and super grateful. So thank you very much, Erin, for just blessing us with earrings. And I say yes and amen, honey. Let the Lord use you. Thank you. You guys, this has been great. So much thanks to Laura, to Emily, to Bob, the one and only button pusher, Bontrager, and especially to Neil Shenvy for coming on and gracing us with all of his wisdom. Are we here next week?
Yeah.
Oh, next week. You guys, next week, we are doing a special All the Things. It is going to be an Ask Us Anything. So feel free to send your questions in advance to info@centerforbiblicalunity.com. info@centerforbiblicalunity.com. And in the subject line, just put ATT question. centerforbiblicalunity.com. info@centerforbiblicalunity.com. That's our email address. info@centerforbiblicalunity.com. And in the subject line, put ATT question, and we will make sure that your questions get answered on our live show next week. That is it. I almost forgot.
And we've got, go check out our new website. I want to say a special thank you to Allison Wardrop, who does our show notes every week. If you've never visited the show notes, it's a wonderful resource. All the links and helpful things are there. We have a brand new website by Amanda Jones. One of our volunteers redesigned the whole thing. We launched it, and it's a wonderful redesign. So go check that out, and make sure you're subscribed, because every Friday we send out a preview of the show. So you can get that in your inbox to let you know what is happening on the show on Saturday. So you can make sure to tune in. All right, y'all. Have a good weekend. Good night, and God bless.
There's nothing